The storm clouds gathered over Chicago that Tuesday evening, casting long shadows across the magnificent lakefront estate that Michael Harrison called home. Lightning flickered in the distance as he stepped out of his black Mercedes, the weight of another failed business negotiation heavy on his shoulders. The 42-year-old real estate mogul had built an empire from the ground up, transforming abandoned warehouses into luxury condominiums that dotted the city skyline. His name appeared on bronze plaques throughout downtown Chicago, a testament to his relentless drive and shrewd business acumen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Yet as he climbed the marble steps leading to his front door, success felt hollow in his chest. The mansion before him stood like a monument to achievement, its windows glowing warmly against the approaching darkness. 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a wine cellar that could stock a small restaurant, and gardens that required a team of landscapers to maintain. Everything money could buy, and yet the silence that greeted him each evening reminded him of what it could not purchase. The heavy oak door closed behind him with a soft thud that echoed through the grand foyer. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the polished floors, and oil paintings worth more than most people's homes hung in gilded frames along the walls. Michael loosened his tie and glanced at his Rolex. 9:45 in the evening. Another day consumed by meetings, phone calls, and the endless pursuit of profit. His son Tommy would be asleep by now, tucked away in his bedroom on the second floor. The 8-year-old had been living with Michael full-time since the divorce 2 years ago, when his ex-wife Sarah decided that motherhood interfered too much with her social calendar. She had moved to Los Angeles with her new boyfriend, a struggling actor 20 years her junior, leaving Tommy behind like an unwanted piece of furniture. Michael poured himself 3 fingers of aged scotch from the crystal decanter in his study, the amber liquid catching the light from the desk lamp. The leather chair creaked as he settled into it, surrounded by shelves lined with business journals and awards that proclaimed his success to an empty room. He had built this life believing that wealth would solve every problem, that money could construct happiness like another real estate development. The irony was not lost on him that his own childhood had been spent in a cramped apartment above his father's corner grocery store, where dinner conversations centered around whether they could afford new school clothes or if the heating bill would have to wait another week. Now he owned 3 homes, drove cars worth more than his father had earned in a lifetime, and employed a small army of people to maintain the lifestyle he had constructed. Yet the loneliness that pressed against his chest each night felt heavier than any financial burden he had ever carried. Tommy was the only brightness in his world, a reminder that not everything valuable could be measured in dollars and cents. The boy had his mother's blonde hair and curious blue eyes, but thankfully little of her vanity or self-absorption. Tommy possessed a gentleness that Michael envied, a capacity for wonder that remained untouched by the cynicism that had hardened his father's heart over years of corporate warfare. Every morning Michael watched his son eat breakfast at the kitchen island, chattering about school projects and playground adventures, and felt both pride and guilt in equal measure. Pride because Tommy was growing into a remarkable child, despite the chaos of his parents' marriage and divorce. Guilt because Michael knew he was failing as a father, too consumed with building his empire to truly connect with the most important person in his life. The thunder rumbled closer now, and Michael finished his scotch in one burning swallow. He had hired Mrs. Patterson 6 months ago to help with Tommy's care. The woman came with impeccable references, having worked for several prominent families in the Chicago area. She was efficient, professional, and maintained the kind of respectful distance that Michael preferred from his employees. She prepared Tommy's meals, helped with homework, and ensured the boy was bathed and in bed by 8:30 each evening. It was a business-like arrangement that suited Michael's need for order and predictability. What he had not expected was how quickly Tommy would grow attached to the middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes. The boys spoke about Mrs. Patterson constantly, sharing stories about the games she taught him and the way she listened when he talked about missing his mother. Michael had initially been pleased that Tommy was adjusting well to having help around the house, but lately he had begun to feel like an outsider in his own home. When he returned from work each evening, Tommy would rush to tell him about his day with Mrs. Patterson, as if she had become the primary parent in the boy's life. The sensation bothered Michael more than he cared to admit. He had worked 16-hour days to provide this life for his son, sacrificing time and energy to ensure Tommy would never want for anything. Yet it seemed the boy found more comfort in the company of a hired caregiver than in his own father's presence. Michael pushed the thought away, attributing his discomfort to exhaustion and the stress of managing a business empire that demanded constant attention. He climbed the wide staircase to the second floor, his footsteps muffled by the Persian runner that stretched along the hallway. The house felt different at night, larger somehow, as if the darkness expanded the already considerable space between rooms. Michael had always preferred the energy of daylight, when the mansion felt like a showcase of his achievements rather than a reminder of his isolation. Tommy's bedroom door was closed, and Michael paused outside it, listening for any sounds from within. The boy sometimes had nightmares, remnants of the trauma from his parents' explosive arguments and subsequent divorce. Michael had suggested therapy, but Tommy had begged not to have to talk to strangers about his feelings, and Michael had relented rather than force the issue. Perhaps it was cowardice, an unwillingness to confront the damage his failed marriage had inflicted on his son. The silence from behind the door reassured Michael that Tommy was sleeping peacefully. He turned toward his own bedroom at the end of the hall, already anticipating the restless night that awaited him. Sleep had become increasingly elusive lately, his mind churning with concerns about market fluctuations, zoning disputes, and the dozen fires that required daily attention in his business life. As he reached for his bedroom door handle, a soft sound stopped him cold. It was barely audible, a gentle rustling that seemed to come from somewhere behind him. Michael turned, straining to locate the source of the noise in the dimly lit hallway. The sound came again, and this time he identified its location. It was coming from the floor outside Tommy's bedroom. Michael's brow furrowed as he retraced his steps down the hallway. The antique grandfather clock at the top of the stairs chimed 10 o'clock, its deep tones resonating through the house. Mrs. Patterson's shift ended at 7 each evening, and she lived in her own apartment across town. There was no reason for anyone to be on the second floor at this hour, yet the soft sounds continued to drift from the area near Tommy's door. As he drew closer, Michael could make out what appeared to be a small bundle on the hardwood floor, positioned directly against the wall beside Tommy's bedroom door. His heart rate quickened as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering up from the foyer below. The bundle moved slightly, and Michael realized with shock that it was a person. Someone was lying on the floor outside his son's room in the middle of the night. Michael's first instinct was to call security, his mind immediately jumping to thoughts of intruders and potential threats to Tommy's safety. His hand moved toward the phone in his pocket, but something about the figure's posture gave him pause. The person was curled up in what appeared to be a sleeping position, not crouched in readiness for attack or flight. The form was small, too small to be an adult male, and seemed to be covered with what looked like a thin blanket. Moving closer with careful steps, Michael could see more clearly now. Long dark hair spilled across a pillow that appeared to be nothing more than a folded sweater. The person was definitely sleeping, their breathing deep and regular. As his eyes adjusted further, Michael felt his confusion deepen into something approaching disbelief. It was Mrs. Patterson, the woman he paid generously to care for his son during business hours, was lying on the floor outside Tommy's bedroom at 10 o'clock at night, apparently having made some sort of makeshift bed on the hardwood. She wore the same blue cardigan and dark slacks she had been wearing when he left for work that morning, though now they were wrinkled from sleep. Her purse sat neatly beside her, along with what appeared to be a thermos and a small paper bag. Michael stood frozen, trying to process what he was seeing. Mrs. Patterson lived in her own apartment 20 minutes away. She had reliable transportation and no reason to remain in his house after her shift ended. Yet here she was, sleeping on the floor like a homeless person who had wandered in from the street. The sight was so incongruous with everything he thought he knew about his employee that his mind struggled to accept the evidence before his eyes. A dozen possibilities raced through his thoughts, each more troubling than the last. Had something happened to her apartment? Was she having financial difficulties despite the generous salary he paid her? Had she missed the last bus and decided to spend the night rather than call for help? None of the explanations felt adequate to explain why a professional caregiver would choose to sleep on a hard floor when comfortable guest rooms sat empty just down the hall. Michael cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle the sleeping woman, but needing answers to the questions flooding his mind. Mrs. Patterson stirred at the sound, her eyes opening slowly as she oriented herself to her surroundings. When she saw Michael standing over her, her face went pale and she sat up quickly, her hand moving to her chest in apparent shock. "Mr. Harrison," she whispered, her voice hoarse from sleep. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean for you to see me." The words only deepened Michael's confusion. She had not meant for him to see her sleeping on the floor of his own house. The implication was that this was not the first time she had spent the night, that she had been doing this without his knowledge for some unknown period. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the storm brewing outside. "Mrs. Patterson," Michael said, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Tommy. "What are you doing here? Why are you sleeping on the floor?" The woman's eyes darted toward Tommy's bedroom door, then back to Michael's face. In the dim light, he could see that she looked older than her 53 years, with deep lines around her eyes that spoke of chronic worry and exhaustion. Her usually neat gray hair was disheveled from sleep, and her clothes bore the wrinkles of someone who had been lying on a hard surface for hours. "I can explain," she said, struggling to her feet with movements that suggested her back and joints were protesting the uncomfortable sleeping arrangement. "I know this looks strange, but I have my reasons." Michael crossed his arms, fighting to maintain his composure despite the surreal nature of the situation. In all his years of employing household staff, he had never encountered anything remotely similar to finding an employee camping out in his hallway like a devoted pet. The sight disturbed him on multiple levels, challenging his understanding of appropriate professional boundaries and raising questions about Mrs. Patterson's mental state. "I'm listening," he said, though his tone carried an edge of authority that reminded both of them of the employer-employee relationship that governed their interaction. Mrs. Patterson glanced again toward Tommy's door, her hands twisting together in a gesture that Michael had learned to recognize as a sign of her nervousness. She took a deep breath as if steeling herself for a difficult confession, and when she spoke, her words came out in a rush that suggested she had been preparing this explanation for some time. "Tommy has been having nightmares," she said, "bad ones. He wakes up crying and calling for his mother, but by the time anyone hears him and comes to help, he's worked himself into such a state that it takes hours to calm him down." Michael felt his stomach clench at her words. Tommy had mentioned bad dreams occasionally, but the boy had never indicated they were severe enough to cause the kind of distress Mrs. Patterson was describing. Michael's own bedroom was at the opposite end of the hall, separated by thick walls and heavy doors that would muffle most sounds. If Tommy was having nightmares severe enough to require immediate attention, it was entirely possible that Michael had been sleeping through them, unaware of his son's suffering. "How long has this been going on?" Michael asked, though he was not certain he wanted to hear the answer. "About 3 weeks," Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "At first I tried staying later in the evenings, hoping to catch him if he had a bad dream. But my shift ends at 7, and the nightmares usually happen between 10 and midnight. I went home one night knowing he might wake up scared and alone, and I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining him crying for help with nobody close enough to hear. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. His son had been suffering from nightmares for 3 weeks, and Michael had been completely unaware. Worse, his employee had taken it upon herself to provide the comfort and security that should have been coming from Tommy's father. The realization filled Michael with a mixture of shame and gratitude that left him struggling to find an appropriate response. "So you decided to sleep in the hallway," Michael said, his voice flat as he tried to process the implications of what he was learning. Mrs. Patterson nodded, her eyes filling with tears that she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. "I know it's not professional. I know I should have asked permission or found another solution. But I couldn't bear the thought of that little boy waking up terrified with nobody there to comfort him. He's been through so much with the divorce and his mother leaving. He needs to know that someone cares enough to be there when he's scared." The words struck Michael with devastating precision, highlighting failures he had been too busy or too proud to acknowledge. He thought of all the evenings he had come home to find Tommy already asleep, all the mornings when he left before the boy woke up, all the opportunities for connection he had sacrificed in pursuit of business success. Michael had convinced himself that providing material security was the most important gift he could give his son, but Mrs. Patterson's presence on the floor outside Tommy's door suggested that what the boy needed most was something far simpler and far more valuable. Have the nightmares stopped?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Michael asked, though the question felt inadequate given the magnitude of what he was learning about his son's emotional state. "They've gotten better," Mrs. Patterson said. "When he wakes up scared, I'm right here. I can go in and sit with him, remind him that he's safe, that someone is watching over him. Most nights now he sleeps through until morning. But I keep staying because I promised him I would. He knows I'm here, and that knowledge seems to help him rest easier." Michael ran his hand through his hair, a gesture that had become habitual when he was overwhelmed by information he was not prepared to handle. The image of his employee sleeping on a hard floor night after night, sacrificing her own comfort to provide security for his son, filled him with a complex mixture of emotions he was not equipped to navigate. Gratitude battled with embarrassment, admiration warred with guilt, and underneath it all was a growing awareness that he had failed Tommy in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Why didn't you tell me about the nightmares?" Michael asked. "Why didn't you come to me for help instead of taking this on yourself?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew carefully neutral, the kind of professional mask that employees learn to wear when they need to deliver uncomfortable truths to their employers. She seemed to weigh her words carefully before responding, and when she spoke, her voice carried a gentleness that somehow made her message more difficult to hear. "You work very hard, Mr. Harrison. You're often not home until late, and you leave early in the mornings. I didn't want to add to your stress by bringing you problems that I could handle myself. And honestly, I wasn't sure how to explain that your son needed more emotional support than his current routine was providing." The diplomatic phrasing could not disguise the underlying message. Mrs. Patterson had not come to him because she had recognized, perhaps more clearly than Michael himself, that he was already absent from his son's life in all the ways that mattered most. She had taken on the role of providing comfort and security because she understood that Michael was either unwilling or unable to fill that need himself. The storm outside had grown stronger, rain beginning to patter against the windows with increasing intensity. The sound provided a backdrop to the conversation that felt appropriate, as if the weather was reflecting the emotional turbulence that had settled over the hallway. Michael looked down at the makeshift bed Mrs. Patterson had created, taking in the details he had missed in his initial shock. The pillow was indeed a folded sweater, but it was placed precisely where her head would rest against the wall beside Tommy's door. a position that would allow her to hear even the quietest sounds from within the room. "How many nights have you been doing this?" Michael asked, though he suspected the answer would only deepen his sense of failure as a father. "Every night for the past 3 weeks," Mrs. Patterson replied without hesitation, "except for last Sunday, when my daughter had her baby and I had to be at the hospital. I arranged for my sister to cover for me that night, though I worried about Tommy the entire time." Michael stared at her, trying to comprehend the level of dedication she was describing. Mrs. Patterson had been sleeping on his floor for 20 nights, sacrificing her own rest and comfort to ensure his son felt secure. She had even arranged backup coverage when family obligations required her absence, treating Tommy's emotional well-being as seriously as any parent would. The depth of her commitment made Michael's own parenting efforts feel shallow and inadequate by comparison. "Your back must be killing you," Michael said, the observation feeling absurdly inadequate given the circumstances, but representing the only response he could manage in his current state of emotional overwhelm. Mrs. Patterson smiled ruefully, one hand moving to her lower back in an unconscious gesture that confirmed his suspicion. "It's not the most comfortable arrangement," she admitted, "but I've slept in worse places, and seeing Tommy wake up happy instead of terrified makes any discomfort worthwhile." The simple statement contained a rebuke that cut deeper than any direct criticism could have. Mrs. Patterson was willing to endure physical pain to ensure Tommy's emotional well-being, while Michael had been so focused on his business concerns that he had remained completely unaware of his son's struggles. The contrast painted a picture of priorities that made Michael deeply uncomfortable with his own choices. Thunder crashed overhead, loud enough to make both adults glance toward Tommy's door with concern. They waited in silence for a moment, listening for any sounds that might indicate the storm had woken the boy. When no cries came from within the room, Mrs. Patterson relaxed slightly, though her attention remained focused on the door as if she was prepared to spring into action at the first sign that Tommy needed comfort. "Does he know you're sleeping out here?" Michael asked, curious about how his son understood the arrangement. "We talked about it," Mrs. Patterson said. "I explained that sometimes people need extra help feeling safe, and that I wanted to be close by in case he had bad dreams. He was worried that I would be uncomfortable, so he brought me one of his stuffed animals to keep me company. He said it would help me have good dreams too." The image of his 8-year-old son providing comfort to the adult who was sacrificing her own comfort for his benefit struck Michael with overwhelming force. Tommy's natural empathy and concern for others stood in stark contrast to Michael's own obliviousness to the people around him who were struggling. The boy had inherited none of his father's emotional blindness, possessing instead a capacity for caring that made Michael both proud and ashamed. "Which stuffed animal?" Michael asked, though the question felt irrelevant compared to the larger issues they were discussing. "Mr. Whiskers," Mrs. Patterson replied, referring to a threadbare stuffed cat that had been Tommy's favorite since he was a toddler. "He said Mr. Whiskers is very good at keeping nightmares away, and he wanted to share that power with me." Michael felt his throat tighten at the thought of his son offering his most cherished possession to ease Mrs. Patterson's discomfort. The gesture revealed a depth of thoughtfulness and generosity that humbled Michael, forcing him to confront how little he truly knew about the person his son was becoming. Tommy's kindness was developing despite his father's absence, not because of his presence, and Michael was beginning to understand that he was in danger of missing his son's childhood entirely. "Where is Mr. Whiskers now?" Michael asked. Mrs. Patterson pointed to her purse, where the edge of a familiar gray ear was just visible. "I keep him with me during the day and bring him back at night. Tommy checks to make sure I have him before he goes to sleep. It's become part of our routine." The routine she described painted a picture of intimacy and care that made Michael realize how peripheral he had become in his own son's life. While he had been focused on building financial security, Mrs. Patterson and Tommy had developed their own rituals and traditions that provided the emotional security Michael had failed to offer. The recognition was painful, but it also sparked something that might have been hope. If Tommy was capable of forming such strong bonds with someone who showed him consistent care and attention, perhaps it was not too late for Michael to rebuild their relationship. "I need to ask you something," Michael said, his voice taking on the serious tone he typically reserved for important business negotiations. "And I need you to be completely honest with me, even if you think it might hurt my feelings." Mrs. Patterson straightened slightly, her expression becoming more alert as she sensed the importance of whatever question was coming. She nodded, indicating her willingness to provide the honesty he was requesting. "Do you think I'm a bad father?" Michael asked, the words feeling strange and vulnerable in his mouth. He had built his entire adult identity around success and competence, rarely allowing himself to acknowledge areas where he might be failing. But the sight of Mrs. Patterson sleeping on his floor to provide comfort his son needed forced him to confront the possibility that his approach to parenting was fundamentally inadequate. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful as she considered how to respond to such a loaded question. When she finally spoke, her words were careful but honest, delivered with the kind of gentle firmness that suggested she had given this matter considerable thought. "I think you're a father who loves his son very much but doesn't know how to show it," she said. "You work incredibly hard to provide for Tommy's physical needs, but I don't think you realize how much he needs your emotional presence. He talks about you all the time, Mr. Harrison. He's proud of your success and grateful for everything you give him. But what he wants most is time with you, attention from you, the feeling that he matters to you as much as your business does." The assessment was delivered without judgment, but its accuracy made it no less difficult to hear. Michael had convinced himself that working long hours was a sacrifice he was making for Tommy's benefit, but Mrs. Patterson's words suggested that his son would gladly trade material advantages for more of his father's time and attention. The realization forced Michael to confront the possibility that his devotion to work was motivated more by his own need for achievement and control than by genuine concern for Tommy's well-being. "He told me once that he wishes you would read him bedtime stories like other dads do," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice soft but clear. "He said you're always too busy or too tired, but that he thinks you would be really good at doing the voices for different characters." Michael felt something crack inside his chest at her words. He could not remember the last time he had read to Tommy, could not recall ever sitting on his son's bed and sharing the simple intimacy of a bedtime story. The admission filled him with shame, but also with a desperate desire to change, to become the father Tommy deserved rather than the distant provider he had allowed himself to become. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. The sound provided a rhythmic backdrop to their conversation, a reminder that the world continued to move around them while they grappled with truths that had the power to reshape their understanding of themselves and each other. "What else does he say about me?" Michael asked, though he was not certain he was prepared to hear the answer. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, clearly weighing whether full honesty would be helpful or harmful in this moment. Her concern for both Tommy and Michael was evident in her expression, the care she felt for this family extending beyond her professional obligations to encompass genuine emotional investment in their well-being. "He says he misses you even when you're in the same house," she replied finally. "He told me that sometimes he pretends to be asleep when you check on him at night because he doesn't want you to feel bad that you missed saying goodnight to him when he was awake." The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and leaving him struggling to maintain his composure. The image of his son pretending to sleep to protect his father's feelings was almost unbearable in its poignancy. Tommy was carrying emotional burdens that no 8-year-old should have to bear, making sacrifices to preserve his father's peace of mind while his own needs went unmet. "He does that," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Patterson nodded sadly. "He's a very thoughtful child, Mr. Harrison. Too thoughtful, perhaps. He worries about being a burden, about taking up too much of your time or energy. I've tried to reassure him that children are supposed to need attention from their parents, but I think he's learned to expect disappointment when it comes to getting your focus." The words painted a picture of his son that filled Michael with equal measures of pride and heartbreak. Tommy's consideration for others was remarkable, but it had developed as a response to emotional neglect that should never have occurred. Michael had been so focused on being a successful provider that he had failed to recognize his role as an emotional anchor in his son's life. "I didn't know," Michael said, the words feeling inadequate but representing the only truth he could offer. "I thought I was doing what was best for him by working hard, by ensuring he would never face the financial struggles I dealt with as a child. I didn't realize I was creating different problems." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened with something that might have been compassion. "Many parents struggle with finding the right balance," she said. "The difference is that most of them don't have the opportunity to make changes once they recognize the problem. You do have that opportunity, Mr. Harrison. Tommy is still young enough that he would welcome more involvement from you. He hasn't given up hope that things could be different." Her words offered both comfort and challenge, suggesting that while Michael had made mistakes, they were not irreversible.
The possibility of redemption existed, but it would require fundamental changes in his priorities and approach to parenting. Michael was not certain he possessed the emotional skills necessary to make such changes, but the alternative, accepting that his relationship with Tommy would remain distant and superficial, was unacceptable. "I don't know how to be the kind of father he needs," Michael admitted, the confession feeling both liberating and terrifying. "I know how to negotiate deals and manage investments, but I don't know how to talk to an 8-year-old about his feelings or fears. I don't know how to be emotionally available in the way you're describing." Mrs. Patterson smiled, the expression carrying warmth and encouragement that made Michael understand why Tommy had grown so attached to her. "Those are learnable skills," she said. "Tommy doesn't need you to be perfect. He just needs you to be present, to show interest in his world, to listen when he talks to you. Children are remarkably forgiving when they sense that their parents genuinely care about them." The conversation was interrupted by a soft sound from within Tommy's bedroom, a small whimper that might have been the beginning of a nightmare. Both adults froze, their attention immediately focused on the door between them and the sleeping child. Mrs. Patterson moved closer to the door, her hand hovering over the handle as she listened for additional sounds that might indicate Tommy needed comfort. The whimper came again, followed by a more distressed cry that suggested the boy was indeed caught in the grip of a bad dream. Mrs. Patterson looked at Michael, a question in her eyes, seeking permission to enter the room and provide the comfort she had been offering for the past 3 weeks. "May I?" she asked softly. Michael nodded, his curiosity about her methods mixing with concern for his son's distress. Mrs. Patterson opened the door slowly, moving into the darkened bedroom with practiced quiet. Michael followed, stopping just inside the doorway to observe how she handled the situation. Tommy was tossing restlessly in his bed, his small form tangled in sheets that bore evidence of his troubled sleep. His face was scrunched in distress, and soft cries escaped his lips as he struggled with whatever demons were visiting his dreams. Mrs. Patterson moved to his bedside without turning on any lights, her voice low and soothing as she spoke his name. "Tommy, sweetheart," she whispered, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "It's just a dream. You're safe. Mrs. Patterson is here." The boy's eyes opened slowly, confusion and fear evident in his expression as he oriented himself to his surroundings. When he saw Mrs. Patterson beside his bed, relief flooded his features, and he reached for her with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been drowning and suddenly found solid ground. "I dreamed that everyone left me," Tommy whispered, his voice thick with tears. "Mommy was gone, and you were gone, and Daddy was too busy to notice."
Mrs. Patterson sat on the edge of his bed, gathering the boy into her arms with the natural ease of someone who had provided this comfort many times before. "That was just a scary dream," she said softly. "Your daddy is here in the house, and I'm right outside your door. Nobody is leaving you, sweetheart." Michael felt his heart clench at his son's words, the child's deepest fears laid bare in the vulnerable honesty that accompanied waking from a nightmare. Tommy was afraid of abandonment, afraid that the people he loved would disappear from his life the way his mother had. The fear was not irrational given his experiences, and Michael realized that his own emotional absence had probably reinforced Tommy's sense that he could not count on the adults in his life to be consistently present. "Is Daddy really here?" Tommy asked, his voice small and uncertain. Mrs. Patterson glanced toward the doorway where Michael stood, her eyes encouraging him to step forward and make his presence known. Michael moved closer to the bed, his heart racing as he approached his son in this moment of vulnerability. "I'm here, buddy," Michael said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm right here." Tommy's eyes widened in surprise and delight at seeing his father in his bedroom in the middle of the night. "Daddy, you came to check on me." The joy in his son's voice at this simple act of parental presence made Michael realize how starved Tommy was for attention from him. Such a basic gesture, checking on a child after a nightmare, was remarkable to Tommy because it fell so far outside their normal routine. Michael sat on the opposite side of the bed from Mrs. Patterson, reaching out tentatively to smooth his son's hair. "Mrs. Patterson told me you were having bad dreams," Michael said. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Tommy leaned into his father's touch, craving the physical comfort he had been missing. "They're really scary dreams, Daddy, but Mrs. Patterson stays close by so I don't have to be afraid for very long." Michael looked across the bed at Mrs. Patterson, who was watching the interaction between father and son with careful attention. Her presence had made this moment possible, had created the circumstances that allowed Michael to see his son's need and respond to it. Without her intervention, Tommy's nightmare would have gone unnoticed and uncomforted, adding another layer to the boy's growing sense that he could not depend on his father for emotional support. "Would you like me to stay until you fall back asleep?" Michael asked, the offer feeling both natural and terrifying. He could not remember the last time he had provided such comfort to his son, could not recall ever prioritizing Tommy's emotional needs over his own schedule and convenience. Tommy's face lit up with an expression of pure happiness that made Michael understand how much he had been missing by maintaining distance from his son's daily life. "Really, you would do that?" "Of course I would," Michael replied, though even as he spoke the words, he was aware that his past behavior had taught Tommy not to expect such availability from him. Mrs. Patterson rose quietly from the bed, recognizing that this was a moment for father and son to share without her presence. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," she whispered to Tommy, leaning down to kiss his forehead with the tenderness of someone who genuinely loved the child in her care. As she moved toward the door, Michael called her name softly. "Mrs. Patterson." She turned back, her expression expectant. "Thank you," Michael said, the words carrying weight far beyond their simplicity. "For everything, for caring about him when I didn't know how." Mrs. Patterson's smile was gentle and understanding. "He's easy to love, Mr. Harrison. You just have to let yourself see how wonderful he is." After she left, Michael found himself alone with his son for the first time in months outside of their brief morning interactions over breakfast. Tommy had snuggled back under his covers, but his eyes remained wide and alert, as if he was afraid that if he fell asleep, his father might disappear. "Tell me about the scary dreams," Michael said, settling more comfortably on the bed. "What happens in them?" Tommy hesitated, clearly unused to having his father's full attention for such personal conversations. "They're about people leaving," he said finally. "Sometimes Mommy comes back, but then she says she changed her mind and goes away again. Sometimes you have to go on a business trip and you don't come back. Sometimes Mrs. Patterson decides she doesn't want to take care of me anymore."
Each fear Tommy described felt like a knife twisting in Michael's chest. His son was carrying anxieties that reflected real experiences of loss and abandonment, fears that were not entirely irrational given the instability he had experienced in his young life. Michael's frequent business travel and emotional unavailability had clearly contributed to Tommy's sense that the people he loved were unreliable and likely to disappear. "I'm not going anywhere, Tommy," Michael said, though he recognized that his words alone would not be enough to erase fears that had been reinforced by months of neglect. "I know I haven't been around as much as I should have been, but I'm going to do better. I want to be the kind of dad you can count on." Tommy studied his father's face with the serious expression of a child who had learned not to trust adult promises too quickly. "Do you mean it, or do you just feel bad because you found out about the nightmares?" The question revealed a wisdom beyond Tommy's 8 years, a hard-earned understanding that adult words and adult actions often failed to align. Michael realized that his son had learned to protect himself from disappointment by questioning promises rather than accepting them at face value. The skepticism was heartbreaking because it was justified. "I mean it," Michael said, meeting his son's searching gaze directly. "Not just because I feel bad, but because I finally understand what I've been missing. I've been so focused on working to give you things that I forgot the most important thing you need from me is my time and attention." Tommy considered this response with the careful deliberation of someone who had been disappointed before. "Mrs. Patterson says that when people really mean something, they show it with their actions, not just their words." The observation stung because it highlighted Michael's pattern of making promises during moments of emotional intensity, only to let the demands of work pull him back into old habits once the immediate crisis passed. Tommy had apparently learned this lesson through experience, developing defenses against the cycle of hope and disappointment that had characterized his relationship with his father. "Mrs. Patterson is very wise," Michael said, "and she's right. I need to show you how much you matter to me, not just tell you. Words are easy, but actions take commitment." They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes, the storm outside providing a gentle backdrop to their conversation. Tommy seemed to be processing everything that had happened, from being woken by a nightmare to finding both his father and Mrs. Patterson ready to provide comfort. Michael used the quiet time to study his son's face, noting details he had missed during their hurried morning interactions. Tommy had lost some of the baby roundness in his cheeks, his features beginning to show hints of the young man he would become. How much of his son's growth had Michael missed by focusing on spreadsheets instead of bedtime stories? "Daddy," Tommy's voice was soft, uncertain. "Yes, buddy. Why did Mrs. Patterson have to sleep on the floor? Don't we have extra bedrooms she could use?" The question demonstrated Tommy's natural empathy and problem-solving abilities, his concern for Mrs. Patterson's comfort revealing a thoughtfulness that made Michael proud, even as it highlighted his own failure to consider practical solutions to the sleeping arrangement. Tommy had clearly been worried about Mrs. Patterson's discomfort, but had not known how to address the issue himself. "We do have extra bedrooms," Michael replied. "I think Mrs. Patterson felt that sleeping in the hallway would let her hear you better if you had a nightmare. But you're right that the floor isn't very comfortable for sleeping." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe she could sleep in the room next to mine. That way she could still hear me, but she wouldn't have to hurt her back." The suggestion was so logical and compassionate that Michael felt embarrassed for not thinking of it himself. Tommy had identified a solution that would address both his need for nearby comfort and Mrs. Patterson's physical well-being, demonstrating the kind of creative problem-solving that came naturally to children, but often got lost in adult overthinking. "That's a wonderful idea," Michael said. "Would you like me to ask Mrs.
Patterson if she would be comfortable with that arrangement?" Tommy's face brightened with the satisfaction of having contributed something useful to solve a problem. "Yes, and maybe we could put a baby monitor in my room so she could hear me even better." Jeremy at school has one in his room because his little sister has asthma and his mom can hear everything. The suggestion revealed that Tommy had been thinking about this issue more deeply than Michael had realized, considering various options for ensuring his safety while minimizing the burden on the adults caring for him. His solution was both practical and considerate, addressing everyone's needs rather than focusing solely on his own comfort. "You've really thought this through," Michael observed, impressed by his son's maturity and consideration for others. "Mrs. Patterson has been really nice to me," Tommy said. "I don't want her to be uncomfortable because of my bad dreams. Maybe if we make it easier for her to help me, she won't get so tired." The statement revealed Tommy's awareness that his needs were creating difficulties for Mrs. Patterson, a burden of guilt that no 8-year-old should have to carry. Michael realized that his son had been worrying about being too much trouble, adding another layer of anxiety to his already complicated emotional landscape. "Tommy, listen to me carefully," Michael said, his voice gentle but firm. "Your needs are not a burden. Children are supposed to need help and comfort from the adults who care about them. Mrs. Patterson doesn't mind helping you because that's what people do when they love someone, and I should have been helping you all along." Tommy's eyes filled with tears that he tried to blink away, his small shoulders carrying weight that Michael was only beginning to understand. "But I don't want to be too much work for people. Mommy said I was too much work, and that's why she had to go away." The words hit Michael like a sledgehammer, revealing the source of many of Tommy's fears and anxieties. Sarah had apparently told their son that his needs were excessive, that caring for him was burdensome enough to justify abandoning him. The cruelty of such a message, delivered to a child who was already struggling with his parents' divorce, filled Michael with rage directed at his ex-wife and shame for his own failure to counteract the damage her words had caused. "Tommy, that is absolutely not true," Michael said, his voice fierce with conviction. "Your mother left because she wasn't ready to be a parent, not because you did anything wrong. You are not too much work. You are not a burden. You are my son, and taking care of you is not work, it's a privilege." Tommy studied his father's face, searching for signs of insincerity or the kind of adult deception he had learned to recognize. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because some of the tension left his small frame and he leaned closer to Michael's warmth. "Mrs. Patterson says that too," Tommy said quietly. "She says that loving people means wanting to take care of them, even when it's hard sometimes." The parallel between Mrs. Patterson's message and Michael's own words was not lost on him. His employee had been providing not just practical care but emotional reassurance, counteracting the damaging messages Tommy had received from his mother. She had been filling gaps in his son's emotional development that Michael had not even realized existed. "Mrs. Patterson is absolutely right," Michael said. "And I'm sorry that I let you think otherwise. I'm sorry that I haven't been showing you how much I love taking care of you." They talked for another hour, their conversation ranging from Tommy's fears about abandonment to his excitement about upcoming school projects. Michael found himself genuinely engaged with his son's perspective on the world, discovering interests and concerns he had never bothered to explore. Tommy was fascinated by astronomy, worried about a classmate who was being bullied, and hoped to learn how to cook so he could make breakfast for Mrs. Patterson as a thank you for her kindness. Each revelation felt like a gift, a glimpse into the rich inner life of a child who had been sharing his thoughts and dreams with someone other than his father. Michael realized that Mrs. Patterson probably knew more about Tommy's daily experiences, friendships and aspirations than he did, a recognition that filled him with both gratitude toward her and determination to reclaim his role in his son's emotional life. When Tommy finally began to drift back toward sleep, his eyelids heavy and his breathing deepening, Michael remained on the bed, unwilling to break the spell of intimacy they had created. He watched his son's face relax into peaceful slumber, noting the way the stress lines around Tommy's eyes smoothed away as he let go of his waking worries. For the first time in years, Michael felt present in his own life rather than constantly planning for future achievements or reviewing past successes.
The quiet rhythm of his son's breathing anchored him in the moment, reminding him that some of life's most important experiences could not be scheduled or optimized. They required simply showing up and being available when opportunity presented itself. Michael carefully extracted himself from Tommy's bed, moving slowly to avoid disturbing the boy's hard-won peace. As he stepped into the hallway, he found Mrs. Patterson still there, though she had moved her makeshift bed further from the door to give father and son privacy for their conversation. She looked up as he emerged, her expression questioning and hopeful. "He's sleeping peacefully," Michael reported quietly. "No more nightmares tonight, I think." Mrs. Patterson smiled with genuine relief. "Good. He seemed calmer when I left the room. I think having you there meant a lot to him." Michael looked down at the woman who had sacrificed her comfort to care for his son, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since she had started working for them. She was not just an employee who performed assigned tasks, she was someone who had opened her heart to Tommy and made his well-being her personal mission. Her dedication went far beyond any job description, reflecting a depth of caring that Michael had failed to recognize or appreciate. "We need to talk," Michael said. "About your sleeping arrangements, about Tommy's care, about a lot of things, but not here in the hallway. Would you be willing to join me in my study? I think we have much to discuss." Mrs. Patterson gathered her few belongings, folding the thin blanket she had been using and tucking Mr. Whiskers safely into her purse. As they walked toward the stairs, Michael found himself seeing his house differently, noticing how cold and impersonal it felt despite its expensive furnishings and perfect maintenance. The mansion that had seemed like the ultimate symbol of his success now felt more like a museum, beautiful but lacking the warmth that transformed a house into a home. His study, with its leather furniture and walls lined with business awards, felt particularly sterile as they settled into chairs across from his massive desk. Michael had chosen this room for important conversations because its formal atmosphere reinforced his authority and success, but tonight it seemed like the wrong setting for the kind of honest discussion they needed to have. "First, I want to apologize," Michael began, abandoning his usual position behind the desk to sit in the chair next to Mrs. Patterson's. "I've been a terrible employer and an even worse father. You've been carrying responsibilities that should have been mine, making sacrifices that I should never have allowed you to make." Mrs. Patterson shook her head gently. "Mr. Harrison, you don't need to apologize to me. I chose to sleep in the hallway because I saw a need and wanted to help. That was my decision. But it shouldn't have been necessary," Michael insisted. "If I had been paying attention to my son's emotional needs, if I had been available when he was struggling, you wouldn't have felt compelled to take such extraordinary measures to ensure his well-being." The acknowledgement hung between them, honest and painful but necessary for any meaningful change to occur. Michael realized that true leadership required taking responsibility for failures rather than deflecting blame, a lesson that applied as much to parenting as it did to business management. "Tommy suggested that you might be more comfortable sleeping in the guest room next to his bedroom," Michael continued. "He's worried about your back, and he thought a baby monitor might help you hear him if he needs comfort during the night." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened with affection for Tommy's thoughtfulness. "He's always thinking about other people's feelings. It's one of the things that makes him so special." "One of many things," Michael agreed. "Things I'm only beginning to discover because I haven't been paying attention the way I should have been." They spent the next 2 hours talking, and for Michael it felt like discovering his son all over again through Mrs. Patterson's eyes. She told him about Tommy's love for science experiments, his concern for stray animals, his habit of saving part of his allowance to buy small gifts for people he cared about. She described his struggles with mathematics, his excitement about learning to play piano, his questions about why his mother had left and whether she would ever come back. Each story revealed new facets of Tommy's personality, painting a picture of a complex, sensitive, intelligent child who was navigating the world with remarkable grace despite the challenges he had faced. Michael found himself alternately amazed by his son's resilience and ashamed of his own absence from these important moments of growth and discovery. "He asks about you constantly," Mrs. Patterson said. "He wants to know about your work, about the buildings you create, about whether you're happy. He's very proud of your success, but I think he wishes he could be part of it somehow." The observation sparked an idea that felt both obvious and revolutionary. Michael had always assumed that his work world and his family life needed to remain completely separate, that bringing Tommy into his professional sphere would be inappropriate and disruptive. But what if he had been wrong? What if there were ways to include his son in aspects of his business that would be educational and meaningful for both of them? "What kinds of questions does he ask about my work?" Michael asked, curious about his son's level of interest and understanding. "He wants to know how you decide where to build things, how you make sure buildings are safe, what happens if you make a mistake," Mrs. Patterson replied. "He's fascinated by the idea that you can imagine something and then make it real. He drew a picture of one of your buildings at school and told his class that his daddy makes homes for families." The image of Tommy proudly presenting his father's work to his classmates filled Michael with warmth and regret. His son was interested in and proud of what he did for a living, but Michael had never thought to share that world with him in age-appropriate ways. He had missed opportunities to connect with Tommy through his passion for construction and development, failing to recognize that his work could be a bridge between them rather than a barrier. "Would you think it appropriate if I occasionally brought Tommy to job sites?" Michael asked, obviously with proper safety precautions, and only to locations where his presence wouldn't be disruptive. "But I'm thinking he might enjoy seeing the process of how buildings come together." Mrs. Patterson's face lit up with enthusiasm. "I think he would love that. He's always building things with his blocks and asking questions about how real construction works. It would mean so much to him to see your world and understand what you do when you're away from home." The conversation continued well past midnight, covering practical matters like Tommy's daily routine, his dietary preferences, his friendships at school, and his ongoing grief over his mother's abandonment. Michael learned that his son had been seeing the school counselor, not because of behavioral problems, but because Mrs. Patterson had recognized signs of depression and anxiety that required professional attention. "You arranged for him to see a counselor?" Michael asked, surprised by this development. "I hope you don't mind," Mrs. Patterson said quickly. "He was having trouble concentrating at school, and his teacher mentioned that he seemed sad most of the time. I thought it might help him to talk to someone trained to work with children who have experienced family disruption." Michael felt a complex mixture of gratitude and embarrassment that his employee had been more attentive to his son's mental health needs than he had been. "I don't mind at all. I'm grateful that you recognized he needed that kind of support. What has the counselor said about his progress?" "She thinks he's very resilient, but that he needs more consistent emotional support at home," Mrs. Patterson replied diplomatically. "She suggested that regular one-on-one time with you might help address some of his anxiety about abandonment." The recommendation was delivered gently, but its implications were clear. Professional assessment had confirmed what Mrs. Patterson had observed through daily interaction. Tommy needed more from his father than financial support and occasional check-ins.
He needed presence, attention, and the security that came from knowing he was a priority in his father's life. "I want to change," Michael said, the words feeling both liberating and terrifying. "I want to be the father Tommy deserves, but I'm not sure I know how to make that transformation. I've been operating on autopilot for so long, focused on work and achievement, that I'm not sure I remember how to prioritize relationships over responsibilities." Mrs. Patterson's expression was understanding and encouraging. "It's not about being perfect, Mr. Harrison. It's about being present. Tommy doesn't need you to completely restructure your life overnight. He just needs to know that he matters to you as much as your business does." Her words offered both hope and challenge, suggesting that the changes required were significant but achievable. Michael realized that becoming a better father would require not just adjusting his schedule, but fundamentally re-examining his priorities and values. Success in parenting could not be measured in the same metrics he used for business achievement. As they concluded their conversation and made plans for restructuring Tommy's care, Michael felt a sense of possibility he had not experienced in years. The discovery of Mrs. Patterson sleeping in his hallway had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his parenting, but it had also opened a door to meaningful change. For the first time since his divorce, Michael felt hopeful about his ability to build a genuine relationship with his son. The storm outside had begun to subside, the thunder moving into the distance and the rain softening to a gentle patter against the windows. As Mrs. Patterson gathered her things to move into the guest room they had prepared for her, Michael felt that the metaphorical storm in their household might be beginning to clear as well. There was still much work to be done, trust to be rebuilt and patterns to be changed, but tonight had provided a foundation for transformation that felt both solid and promising. Standing in his study after Mrs. Patterson had gone to settle into her new room, Michael looked around at the symbols of his professional success with new eyes. The awards and accolades that had once filled him with pride now felt hollow compared to the simple joy he had experienced sitting on Tommy's bed and listening to his son's thoughts and dreams. He was beginning to understand that true wealth could not be measured in dollars or recognition, but in the quality of relationships and the depth of love shared with the people who mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to demonstrate the changes he wanted to make in his approach to fatherhood. But tonight, for the first time in years, Michael Harrison felt like he might actually have a chance to become the man his son needed him to be. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Harrison mansion, casting golden streams across the breakfast table, where Michael sat with his coffee, waiting for Tommy to come downstairs. 3 weeks had passed since the night he discovered Mrs. Patterson sleeping in the hallway, and the changes in their household routine had been gradual but significant. Michael had rearranged his schedule to be home for breakfast every morning, a commitment that had required delegating more responsibilities to his business partners and declining several early morning meetings. Tommy bounded into the kitchen with an energy that had become increasingly common since his father had begun showing more consistent presence in his daily life. The boy's nightmares had decreased in frequency and intensity, though they had not disappeared entirely. Mrs. Patterson still maintained her vigil in the guest room adjacent to Tommy's bedroom, but her nights were more restful now that she had a proper bed and the assurance that Michael was taking a more active role in addressing his son's emotional needs. "Good morning, Dad," Tommy said, climbing onto his usual stool at the kitchen island. The casual use of Dad instead of the more formal Daddy represented a subtle shift in their relationship, suggesting that Tommy was beginning to see Michael as more of a partner than an authority figure to be approached with caution. "Morning, buddy," Michael replied, setting down his newspaper to give Tommy his full attention. This small gesture had taken conscious effort initially, as Michael's habit had been to multitask during meals, reviewing emails or financial reports while eating. The discipline of being present during their shared time was paying dividends in the form of more open communication and genuine connection between father and son. Mrs. Patterson entered the kitchen carrying a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, her movements efficient but unhurried. She had adapted well to her new living arrangement, though Michael suspected she still felt somewhat uncomfortable with the blurred boundaries between employee and family member. Her dedication to Tommy's well-being had earned her a permanent place in their household, but the transition from housekeeper to something approaching surrogate family had created complexities that none of them had fully anticipated. "Mrs. Patterson, will you join us for breakfast?" Michael asked, a question that had become part of their morning routine. He had learned that she often skipped meals in favor of focusing on Tommy's needs, a pattern of self-neglect that reminded him uncomfortably of his own tendency to prioritize work over personal care. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison, but I have laundry to finish," she replied, though her tone suggested she appreciated the invitation even as she declined it. Tommy looked up from his eggs with the serious expression he wore when addressing important matters. "Dad, I've been thinking about what we talked about last week, about maybe visiting one of your construction sites." Michael felt a familiar surge of pride mixed with anxiety whenever Tommy expressed interest in his work. The boy's enthusiasm was genuine, but Michael worried about safely integrating his son into a professional environment that was not designed to accommodate children. The construction industry involved heavy machinery, dangerous materials, and time-sensitive deadlines that left little room for the patient explanations an 8-year-old would require. "I've been looking into that," Michael said carefully. "There's a new residential project in Lincoln Park that might be perfect for a visit. It's still in the early stages, so the safety concerns are minimal, and the foreman is someone I trust completely." Tommy's face brightened with excitement, but his next words revealed the thoughtfulness that continually surprised Michael. "Would Mrs. Patterson be able to come with us? I think she might like to see what you do too, and she could help explain things if I don't understand." The suggestion demonstrated Tommy's natural inclination to include Mrs. Patterson in family activities, a pattern that reflected both his affection for her and his desire to create inclusive experiences rather than exclusive ones. Michael realized that his son was unconsciously teaching him about the importance of considering everyone's feelings and perspectives when making plans. "That's a wonderful idea," Michael said. "Mrs. Patterson, would you be interested in joining us for a tour of the construction site this Saturday?" Mrs. Patterson paused in her cleaning, clearly surprised by the invitation. "I wouldn't want to interfere with your father-son time," she said diplomatically. "You wouldn't be interfering," Tommy said earnestly. "You're part of our family now. Dad says family means people who care about each other, not just people who are related by blood." The statement caught Michael off guard, both because he could not remember making such a declaration, and because Tommy's interpretation of family reflected a wisdom and inclusiveness that humbled him. Somewhere in their conversations over the past few weeks, Michael must have communicated values about chosen family and emotional bonds that Tommy had internalized and was now applying to their situation with Mrs. Patterson. "Tommy's right," Michael said, finding that the words felt natural despite the unconventional nature of their household arrangement. "You've become an important part of our family, and we'd like you to be included in activities that matter to us." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears that she quickly wiped away, clearly moved by the acceptance and inclusion being offered. "I would be honored to join you," she said softly. Their breakfast was interrupted by the ringing of Michael's cell phone, a sound that had once caused him to immediately abandon whatever he was doing to take the call. This morning, however, he glanced at the caller ID and made a conscious decision to let it go to voicemail. The call was from his business partner James, and while their conversations were always important, Michael had committed to protecting his morning time with Tommy from work intrusions. "Aren't you going to answer that?" Tommy asked, clearly having noticed his father's unusual restraint. "It can wait," Michael replied. "Right now I'm having breakfast with my son, and that's more important than any phone call." The words were spoken casually, but their impact on Tommy was immediate and visible. The boy's posture straightened with pride, and his smile carried a brightness that reminded Michael of the joy children experienced when they felt truly valued and prioritized. Such a simple act, choosing not to answer a phone call, had communicated more about Michael's changing priorities than any lengthy explanation could have achieved. After Tommy left for school and Mrs. Patterson began her daily tasks, Michael retreated to his study to return James's call. His business partner's voice carried an urgency that immediately put Michael on alert. "We have a problem with the Morrison project," James said without preamble. "The city inspector found some irregularities in the foundation work, and they're threatening to shut us down until we can prove compliance with safety regulations." Michael felt his stomach clench as he processed the implications of James's news. The Morrison project was their largest current development, a luxury high-rise that represented months of planning and millions of dollars in investment. Any significant delays would have cascading effects on their other projects, their relationships with investors, and their reputation in the competitive Chicago real estate market. "What kind of irregularities?" Michael asked, his mind already racing through possible solutions and damage control strategies. The concrete mixture doesn't match the specifications in our approved plans, James replied. Our contractor swears they followed the blueprint exactly, but the inspector's tests show different results. We're looking at potential structural integrity issues that could require tearing down and rebuilding the entire foundation. The news hit Michael like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality that his efforts to maintain better work-life balance had coincided with the emergence of a crisis that could threaten everything he had built. The timing felt cruelly ironic, as if the universe was testing his commitment to prioritizing family over business success. "I'll be there in an hour," Michael said, his instincts pulling him toward the familiar territory of crisis management and problem solving. "Actually, Michael, there's something else," James continued, his tone becoming even more serious. "The inspector mentioned that someone called in an anonymous tip about our construction practices. This wasn't a routine inspection. Someone wanted the city to take a closer look at our work." The revelation added a sinister dimension to what Michael had initially assumed was a bureaucratic mishap or contractor error. Someone with knowledge of their operations had deliberately targeted the Morrison project, suggesting either a disgruntled employee or a competitor seeking to damage their business. The possibility of corporate sabotage introduced variables that could not be easily controlled or predicted. Michael spent the next 4 hours at the construction site, working with engineers, city officials and contractors to assess the scope of the problem and develop a plan for moving forward. The foundation issues were serious but not insurmountable, requiring additional testing and potentially some remedial work but not the complete reconstruction James had initially feared. However, the investigation into how the concrete specifications had been altered revealed troubling gaps in their quality control processes. The anonymous tip had come from someone familiar with their internal procedures, someone who knew exactly where to direct the inspector's attention for maximum impact. Michael's review of recent personnel changes and contractor relationships yielded several potential suspects, but no clear evidence of who might be responsible for the sabotage. By the time Michael returned home, Tommy was already back from school and working on homework in the kitchen under Mrs. Patterson's supervision. The domestic scene felt surreal after the chaos and tension of the construction site, highlighting the contrast between his two worlds and the challenge of maintaining presence in both simultaneously. "How was your day, Dad?" Tommy asked, looking up from his mathematics workbook with genuine interest. Michael hesitated, torn between his desire to protect Tommy from adult worries and his commitment to being more open and present in their relationship. The crisis at work felt overwhelming and urgent, demanding his full attention and strategic focus. Yet the expectant look on his son's face reminded him that Tommy's needs for connection and communication were equally important, even if they seemed less dramatic than foundation failures and corporate sabotage. "It was challenging," Michael said, choosing honesty without unnecessary detail. "We discovered some problems with one of our construction projects that will require a lot of time and attention to fix." Tommy's expression became concerned, reflecting his growing understanding that his father's work involved real pressures and responsibilities. "Is it something really bad? Do you have to work late tonight?" The questions revealed Tommy's continuing anxiety about his father's availability, his fear that work crises would once again take precedence over family time. Michael realized that how he handled this situation would either reinforce Tommy's trust in their new relationship or confirm his worst fears about being abandoned when other priorities emerged. "It is serious," Michael acknowledged, "but I made a promise to be here for dinner and to help you with your homework, and I intend to keep that promise. The problems at work will still be there tomorrow, but tonight belongs to our family." Mrs. Patterson looked up from the vegetables she was preparing, her expression reflecting surprise and approval at Michael's response.
She had observed the gradual changes in his priorities over the past few weeks, but this moment represented a more definitive choice between competing demands on his time and attention. "What if the problems get worse while you're here with me?" Tommy asked, his worry evident in his voice. Michael sat down beside his son, recognizing that this conversation was about more than work schedules and crisis management. Tommy was seeking reassurance that he mattered enough to his father to compete successfully with business obligations, that their relationship had become strong enough to withstand external pressures. "Then we'll deal with worse problems tomorrow," Michael said simply. "But tonight I want to hear about your day at school, help you with your math homework, and maybe read a story together before bedtime. Those things are important too, and they deserve my full attention." Tommy's smile was radiant with relief and happiness, confirming that Michael had given the right answer, even though it felt uncomfortable and risky given the magnitude of the work crisis he was facing. The decision to prioritize family time over business urgency represented a fundamental shift in his values, one that felt both liberating and terrifying. Their dinner conversation was animated and engaging, with Tommy sharing stories about his science project on volcanoes and his excitement about an upcoming field trip to the Natural History Museum. Mrs. Patterson contributed observations about Tommy's progress with piano lessons and his growing confidence in social situations at school. Michael found himself genuinely engaged with these domestic details, discovering that his son's world was far more interesting and complex than he had previously realized.
After dinner, as promised, Michael helped Tommy with his mathematics homework, patiently working through long division problems that tested both of their patience and persistence. The academic work was challenging for Tommy, but Michael noticed that his son was more willing to struggle with difficult concepts when he felt supported and encouraged rather than rushed or criticized. "I'm getting better at this," Tommy observed with satisfaction as he completed a particularly complex problem. "You are," Michael agreed. "And you're learning that it's okay to work hard at things that don't come easily. That's an important lesson that will help you in many areas of life." Their bedtime routine had evolved over the past few weeks to include story time, a ritual that Michael had initially approached with some awkwardness but had come to treasure. Tonight's selection was a chapter from a fantasy novel about a young wizard learning to control his magical powers, a story that provided opportunities for discussion about responsibility, perseverance, and the importance of good mentors. "The wizard in the story reminds me of you," Tommy said as Michael closed the book. "How so?" Michael asked, curious about his son's perspective. "He has a lot of power, but he's learning how to use it to help people instead of just getting what he wants," Tommy explained. "And he has to practice being a good person, not just being strong." The observation struck Michael with unexpected force, revealing that Tommy was drawing parallels between fictional characters and real-life relationships in ways that suggested remarkable insight for an 8-year-old. His son was processing their family changes through the lens of literature, finding meaning and guidance in stories that helped him understand the world around him. "That's a very thoughtful observation," Michael said. "Do you think the wizard will learn to balance his power with his responsibilities?" "I think so," Tommy replied confidently. "He has good teachers and he wants to do the right thing. Sometimes that's enough to help people change, even when it's hard." As Michael tucked Tommy into bed and kissed him good night, he reflected on the wisdom his son had shared and its application to his own journey as a father and business leader. The challenges at work would indeed require his attention and strategic thinking, but they did not have to consume his entire identity or dictate all of his choices. Like the wizard in Tommy's story, he was learning to balance power with responsibility, success with relationships, achievement with presence. Mrs. Patterson was waiting in the hallway when Michael emerged from Tommy's room, her expression thoughtful and slightly concerned. "Mr. Harrison, I hope you don't mind my asking, but is everything all right with your business? Tommy mentioned that you seemed worried today." Michael appreciated her directness and her concern for how work stress might affect the family dynamics they had all worked to improve. "We're facing some significant challenges with one of our major projects," he admitted. "The kind of problems that in the past would have kept me at the office until midnight for several weeks running. But you chose to come home instead," Mrs. Patterson observed. "I chose to honor my commitments to Tommy," Michael clarified. "And I'm discovering that some of my best thinking happens when I'm not frantically trying to solve every problem immediately. Distance and perspective can be as valuable as immediate action." Mrs. Patterson nodded with understanding. "Tommy has been so much happier since you began spending more time at home. He talks constantly about your morning breakfasts and evening stories. I think he would understand if you occasionally needed to work late, but knowing that family time is your priority has given him a security he didn't have before." Her words reinforced Michael's conviction that his changing approach to work-life balance was beneficial for Tommy, even though it created additional pressure in his professional life. The foundation of trust and connection they were building would provide stability for both of them during future challenges, making the investment in relationship building a practical as well as emotional necessity. The following morning brought news that the foundation issues at the Morrison project were more extensive than initially believed, requiring a complete redesign of the structural support system and delays that would cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Michael's phone rang constantly with calls from investors, contractors and city officials, all seeking immediate answers to complex questions that would require weeks of investigation and planning to resolve properly. Tommy noticed his father's tension during breakfast, though Michael was attempting to maintain their normal routine despite the crisis unfolding around them. "Dad, you look really worried today. Is the problem at work getting worse?" Michael considered deflecting the question or minimizing the severity of the situation, but his commitment to honesty in their relationship required acknowledging the reality of adult pressures without burdening Tommy with inappropriate details. "The problems are more complicated than we initially realized," he said. "It's going to require a lot of creative thinking and hard work to find solutions. Are you going to lose a lot of money?" Tommy asked with the direct curiosity of childhood. "Possibly," Michael replied. "But money can be earned again. What matters most is that we fix the problems safely and honestly, even if it costs more than we planned." Tommy considered this response with the seriousness he brought to important conversations. "Is that why you're not going to work early today? Because fixing problems is more important than making money quickly?" The question revealed Tommy's growing understanding of the values his father was attempting to model, as well as his awareness that Michael's presence at breakfast represented a choice rather than coincidence. His son was learning to recognize integrity and prioritization through observation rather than lecture, absorbing lessons about character through daily example. "That's exactly right," Michael confirmed. "And because having breakfast with you gives me the energy and perspective I need to handle difficult situations effectively." The sentiment was genuine rather than diplomatic, reflecting Michael's growing recognition that his relationship with Tommy provided emotional resources that enhanced rather than detracted from his professional effectiveness. The calm and purpose he derived from meaningful family interactions helped him approach business challenges with clearer thinking and steadier judgment. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Patterson, who entered the kitchen looking unusually flustered. "Mr. Harrison, there's a woman at the front door who says she needs to speak with you immediately. She claims to be from the building inspection department, but she's not in uniform and doesn't have proper identification." Michael felt his pulse quicken as he processed this information. Official building inspectors typically scheduled appointments and arrived with proper credentials and documentation. An unscheduled visit from someone claiming government authority suggested either an emergency situation or something more troubling. "Did she give you her name?" Michael asked, moving toward the front of the house. "She said her name was Detective Rivera and that she's investigating construction fraud," Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice reflecting concern about the implications of such a visit. The word detective sent a chill through Michael's chest, transforming what he had assumed was a civil matter involving building codes and safety regulations into something that could have criminal implications. Construction fraud investigations could result in charges ranging from regulatory violations to criminal conspiracy, with potential consequences that included substantial fines, business closure, and even imprisonment. Michael found Detective Rivera waiting in his foyer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a professional demeanor that suggested she was accustomed to asking difficult questions and evaluating responses for truthfulness. She wore a dark suit and carried a badge that appeared authentic, though Michael's limited experience with law enforcement left him uncertain about proper procedures and protocols. "Mr. Harrison, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me," Detective Rivera said, her tone polite but formal. "I'm investigating allegations of fraudulent construction practices related to your Morrison project. I understand you've recently discovered some irregularities in your foundation work." Michael felt his stomach drop as he realized that the anonymous tip that had triggered the building inspection was apparently part of a larger investigation into potential criminal activity. Someone had not merely reported construction irregularities to city officials, they had contacted law enforcement with allegations serious enough to warrant detective involvement. "I'm happy to cooperate with your investigation," Michael said carefully, "but I should probably contact my attorney before we proceed with detailed discussions." Detective Rivera nodded with understanding. "That's certainly your right, and probably wise given the nature of the allegations. However, I can tell you that we've received information suggesting that your company has been systematically cutting corners on safety requirements to increase profit margins. The informant claims to have documentation proving deliberate fraud spanning multiple projects over several years. The scope of the allegations was breathtaking in its potential consequences, threatening not only the Morrison project, but Michael's entire business empire and personal reputation. Systematic fraud charges could result in criminal prosecution, civil lawsuits from investors and property owners, and regulatory sanctions that would effectively end his career in construction and development. Detective Rivera, I can assure you that my company has never deliberately violated safety regulations or building codes," Michael said, though he was aware that his assurance carried little weight without supporting evidence. "We take our responsibilities to public safety extremely seriously." "I'm sure you do," the detective replied diplomatically. "That's why I'm hoping you'll be willing to provide access to your project records, contractor agreements, and financial documentation. Transparency will help us determine whether these allegations have merit or whether someone is making false accusations for personal reasons." The request for comprehensive documentation was both reasonable and terrifying, as Michael realized that years of business records would be scrutinized by investigators looking for evidence of wrongdoing. Even innocent mistakes or minor irregularities could be interpreted as evidence of criminal intent when viewed through the lens of a fraud investigation. Tommy appeared in the hallway, drawn by voices and the unusual presence of a stranger in their home. His expression was curious rather than concerned, as he had no context for understanding the significance of a police investigation or its potential impact on their family's stability. "Dad, is everything okay?" Tommy asked, moving closer to Michael with the natural instinct of a child seeking security during uncertain situations. "Everything's fine, buddy," Michael replied, though the words felt hollow given the circumstances. "This lady just needs to ask me some questions about work. Why don't you go finish getting ready for school?" Detective Rivera watched the interaction between father and son with the trained observation skills of someone accustomed to evaluating family dynamics and stress responses. Her expression softened slightly as she observed Tommy's trust in his father and Michael's protective instincts toward his child. "I have a son about his age," the detective said after Tommy had left. "This kind of investigation is stressful for families, especially when children are involved. I want you to know that we'll handle this as discreetly as possible." The acknowledgement of Tommy's presence in the situation added another layer of urgency to Michael's need to resolve the fraud allegations quickly and definitively. His son's sense of security and trust in their family's stability could be shattered if the investigation resulted in criminal charges or business failure. The potential for collateral damage to innocent family members made the stakes personal as well as professional. "I appreciate your consideration," Michael said. "My son has already been through significant disruption with his parents' divorce. I'm committed to minimizing any additional trauma from this situation." Detective Rivera nodded with apparent understanding. "Then I'm sure you'll want to clear this up as quickly as possible. Would you be available to meet with me and your attorney tomorrow morning? We can review the allegations in detail and discuss what documentation we'll need to conduct a thorough investigation." Michael agreed to the meeting, though the timeline felt impossibly compressed given the complexity of the issues involved and the potential consequences of the investigation. After Detective Rivera left, he stood in his foyer trying to process the magnitude of the crisis that had suddenly engulfed his carefully constructed life. The fraud allegations threatened everything he had built, not just his business empire but his newfound relationship with Tommy and the family stability they had been working to create. If the investigation resulted in criminal charges or business failure, he might lose not only his wealth and reputation, but also his ability to provide the secure home environment that Tommy desperately needed. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the hallway, her expression reflecting concern and confusion about the morning's events. "Mr. Harrison, is there anything I should know about this situation? Anything that might affect Tommy or our household?" Michael appreciated her directness and her focus on protecting Tommy from potential harm. "I'm being investigated for alleged construction fraud," he said, choosing honesty over false reassurance. "The allegations are serious, but I believe they're false. However, the investigation could be disruptive and stressful for our family." Mrs. Patterson absorbed this information with the calm professionalism that had characterized her response to previous crises. "What can I do to help maintain stability for Tommy during this difficult time?" Her immediate focus on Tommy's well-being rather than her own job security or the family's financial situation reminded Michael of why she had become such an invaluable part of their household. Her loyalty extended beyond employment obligations to encompass genuine care for their family's welfare. "Keep our routines as normal as possible," Michael replied. "Tommy doesn't need to know the details of the investigation, but he'll sense the stress and uncertainty. Consistent daily structure will help him feel secure even if other aspects of our life become chaotic." As Michael prepared to leave for emergency meetings with his attorney and business partners, he realized that the crisis would test not only his business acumen and legal resources, but also his commitment to the new priorities he had established in his relationship with Tommy. The temptation to revert to his old patterns of working 18-hour days and sacrificing family time for crisis management would be enormous, but the foundation of trust he had built with his son was too precious to abandon even in the face of potential professional disaster. The next few weeks would determine whether Michael could maintain his role as a present and engaged father while simultaneously fighting for his business survival and personal reputation. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome would shape not only his own future but Tommy's sense of security and trust in the world around him. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.